December 7th,
It's history.
1941,
The events.
a date which will
The
live
drama.
in
The
infamy.
figures.
This was our finest hour.
It's hardcore history.
What is a monument? If you think about what that term means, a monument is some sort of commemoration. It's a reminder. A monument could be to an event, could be to a person. You see statues all over the world commemorating important or noteworthy individuals. You see all sorts of architectural monuments around the world reminding us of some important event or honoring, important people or times or places. Now, most occurrences where a monument is put up is something that's well thought out and designed. Some monuments are the most artistic and beautiful things that human hands have ever crafted. Monuments all over, for example, Rome today from past history. Places like Paris full of monuments. London full of monuments. Washington, D.C., all over the world, right? But there are some monuments that are inadvertent commemorations that were never designed, were never crafted by human hands, and yet can be more powerful than anything we put together to remind us of the past. One of those inadvertent monuments is said to exist in southern Russia. And you could almost call it legendary because part of me thinks that if it were really there, we would have heard a lot more about it. But the people who have written about it are very credible, so I tend to believe them. One of the people who visited this inadvertent monument is an author named Donovan Webster, who wrote a book called Aftermath. And Aftermath is a book about the modern-day condition of 20th century battlefields. For example, he takes you in one story to modern-day France and tours the World War I battlefields there and talks about, the shells that still keep coming to the surface and exploding and the places in France on the battlefields that are still cordoned off where people aren't allowed to go because they'll get blown up still from ordnance that's 100 years old. But the most haunting part of Donovan Webster's book is when he takes, several planes and a bunch of cars to get to this spot in the middle of nowhere on the steppes of southern Russia to see something that very few people know is there, especially outside of Russia. And he says he had a guide with him, and they pulled the car up to this spot, and it was in the middle of a very flat plain, and you could see way off into the distance, all the way to the horizon, miles away. And he says that he and the guide got out of the car, their boots crunching on the snow-filled field, and the guide told him to look down. And Webster says when his eyes adjusted to the blinding white of the snow and the plains and everything, he could make out strange shapes in the snow. And the guide picked up one of these shapes and showed it to Webster. And it was a bone. A human bone. And he and Webster begin walking around this field, picking up clavicles and thigh bones and jaw bones and pieces of skulls, and they are everywhere. He says there are also jack boots that you come across and all sorts of leather gear, all the refuse and debris of human existence that you might imagine still sitting around this field. And he says you can look off into the horizon and these bones are sticking up out of the snow as far as you can see for miles. The guide tells him that this is a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of how far this bone field, he calls it, stretches. This bone field is a monument, an inadvertent commemoration of an important event with many, many, many lessons to teach modern-day people today. And it's out in the middle of nowhere. The nearest major city is a place called Volgograd, which may not ring a bell in your memory. But Volgograd used to have another name. It used to be called Stalingrad. These skeletons lying on this bone field that Webster was picking up out of the snow are the remains of Hitler's Wehrmacht from the Second World War. And this was the breakwater that the tide of Nazi expansion broke against before it began to recede back to the borders of Germany. This is as far as they got. And there may be 300,000 human beings in an area about 30 miles long and 20 miles deep. And in a very strange